You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The region known as the Illinois Country, which now makes up much of Indiana and Illinois, was once part of New France's Louisiana district. This changed after the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, when France handed over the control of this area east of the Mississippi River to the British, as per the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Later, in 1774, the British incorporated eastern Illinois into the expanded province of Quebec through the Quebec Act. By 1778, the Illinois country was home to around 1,000 Europeans, primarily French speakers, and about 600 African American slaves. Additionally, thousands of Native Americans settled along the rivers Mississippi, Illinois, and Wabash. The British military had few troops in the area, having reduced their presence in 1776 to save expenses. Philippe François de Rastel de Rocheblave, a French-born soldier and official, was tasked by the British to command Fort Gage in Kaskaskia, although he often reported struggles with insufficient funds, resources, and manpower to effectively look after the French villages and forts from threats. With the start of the American Revolutionary War in 1775, the Ohio River became a boundary between the Illinois country and Kentucky, a region recently colonized by American settlers. Initially, the British hoped to keep Native Americans neutral, but in 1777 they began recruiting and arming them to attack the Kentucky frontier, turning it into a battleground of the war. As historian Bernard Sheehan described, from that year onward, settlers faced relentless attacks from war parties that were mostly led by whites and had set out from Detroit. In the midst of these tensions, 25-year-old George Rogers Clark, a major in the Kentucky County, Virginia militia, proposed a bold plan. He theorized that taking control of the British posts in the Illinois country could stop the raids on Kentucky and even pave the way to capture Detroit. In April 1777, Clark secretly sent 2 spies to gather intelligence on the Illinois country. They found that Kaskaskia's fort was poorly guarded. The local French-speaking population wasn't particularly loyal to the British, and an attack from Kentucky was unexpected. Based on their findings, Clark approached Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia with a strategy to seize Kaskaskia. In October 1777, because settlers in Kentucky didn't have the resources or authority to launch an expedition due to ongoing Indian raids, George Rogers Clark made his way to Williamsburg, using the Wilderness Road. On his journey, he accompanied a group of about 100 settlers leaving Kentucky for the same reason. Once in Williamsburg, Clark pitched his strategic plan to Governor Patrick Henry on December 10, 1777. To keep the mission under wraps, only a select few among Virginia's elite, including Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, and George Wythe, were let in on Clark's proposal. Even though Governor Henry had his reservations about whether Clark's ambitious plan could actually work, Clark's persuasion skills won them over. The Virginia General Assembly agreed to the plan, but were mostly kept in the dark about the specifics, consenting to Clark's recruitment of men under the guise of defending Kentucky. However, Clark received secret orders from Governor Henry to take Kaskaskia and then move forward as he deemed appropriate. Clark was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given permission to form 7 militia companies for this task, which would become known as the Illinois Regiment. Not part of the National Continental Army, but rather the Virginia State Forces, these men were enlisted for a stint of 3 months upon their arrival in Kentucky. Keeping his true intentions close to his chest, Clark never disclosed to his recruits that their real mission was to venture into the Illinois country. With a budget of £1,200 in continental currency, a sum greatly affected by inflation and British counterfeiting efforts, Clark set about raising his force and procuring supplies. He established a base at Redstone Old Fort on the Monongahela River and was joined by Joseph Bowman, Leonard Helm, and William Harrod, each tasked with rallying men to the cause. Furthermore, Captain William Bailey Smith was appointed as a major and handed £150 to enlist 4 companies from the Holston River Valley before rendezvousing with Clark in Kentucky. Yet, recruiting the full quota of 350 men for the Illinois Regiment proved more complicated than anticipated. The recruiters faced competition from the Continental Army and other militia units, encountered skepticism over Kentucky's strategic importance, and navigated the reluctance of settlers in the Holston Valley, who were preoccupied with threats from Cherokees to the south. Additionally, a boundary dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia deterred many Pennsylvanians from volunteering, perceiving the campaign as an effort solely to fortify Virginia's borders. In May 1778, after waiting a bit so more people could join up, Clark hit the road, or rather the water, from Redstone with around 150 guys ready for action. They were split into groups, led by Captains Bowman, Helm, and Harrod. Clark was looking forward to meeting 200 more troops under Captain Smith at the Falls of the Ohio in Kentucky. Not just soldiers were on the move, though. About 20 families were also heading to Kentucky, looking to start anew. As they made their way down the Ohio River, Clark and his crew stopped to grab supplies from Forts Pitt and Henry. Thanks to General Edward Hand from the Continental Army's Western Department, they even swung by Fort Randolph in West Virginia, right after it had a rough time with an Indian raid. The fort's leader hoped Clark would chase after the attackers, but Clark had a schedule to keep and couldn't afford the delay. Getting closer to the falls of the Ohio, Clark dropped a message to Major Smith by the Kentucky River. He was saying, "Let's meet up." But he soon found out that Smith's big talk of 4 companies boiled down to just a bit of one, led by Captain Dillard. So Clark reached out to Colonel John Bowman, asking for Dillard's squad and any other fighters he could muster to join him at the falls. By May 27th, Clark and his makeshift fleet made it to the falls of the Ohio. They set up camp on Corn Island amid the rapids. After the Kentucky and Holston reinforcements showed up, Clark beefed up his forces with 20 of them, sending the rest back for Kentucky's defense. These new guys, including a soon-to-be famous scout named Simon Kenton, were placed under Captain John Montgomery. It was on this island that Clark let everyone in on the true mission. They were going to take the Illinois country. This bombshell thrilled many, though it scared off some of the Holston men. Despite a few desertions, most were caught and brought back. The group didn't just prepare for the mission on the island. The families that came along got to planting corn. These settlers eventually moved to the mainland, founding what we now know as Louisville. During this pivotal time, Clark got word from Pittsburgh that France had entered into an alliance with the U.S. Hopeful news he thought might help win over the Canadian folks in the Illinois Territory. On June 24, 1778, Clark and about 175 of his men embarked on their journey from Corn Island, leaving behind a small group of soldiers considered not robust enough to make the trip. These soldiers stayed back to look after their supplies and keep company with the families on the island. Clark's team was divided into 4 companies, each led by Captains Bowman, Helm, Harrod, and Montgomery. Their departure was marked by the drama of a total solar eclipse, an event some took as a positive sign for their mission. By June 28th, they had made their way to the mouth of the Tennessee River, stopping on an island to gear up for the final leg of their quest. Under normal circumstances, the route to Kaskaskia involved continuing to the Mississippi River and paddling upstream. However, aiming for the element of surprise in capturing Kaskaskia, Clark opted for a land march across what is now Illinois' southern tip, a 120-mile challenge. During this trek, they intercepted a group of American hunters led by John Duff, who had just been to Kaskaskia. These hunters, turned guides, provided valuable intelligence on the village and agreed to assist Clark. That same night, the expedition set up on the north side of the Ohio River, close to the remnants of Fort Massac, an old French fort left behind after the French and Indian War. Their journey led them through 50 miles of dense forest into open prairie. At one point, when their guide confessed to being lost, Clark, suspecting foul play, issued a stern ultimatum which got them back on track. The expedition arrived on the outskirts of Kaskaskia by July 4th, starving, having exhausted their supplies 2 days before. According to Joseph Bowman, the hunger-fueled resolve was to take the town or die in the attempt. They crossed the Kaskaskia River under the cover of midnight, seizing the city silently. In Fort Gage, they captured Rocheblav, a key figure, right in his bed. The next day, Clark focused on winning over Kaskaskia's residents, a task simplified by news of the Franco-American alliance. He urged them to swear loyalty to Virginia and the United States, with the added assurance from Clark that the Catholic Church would remain protected under Virginia's laws. Clark's influence expanded rapidly to the surrounding French settlements, with Captain Bowman leading a successful persuasion of Prairie du Rocher, Saint-Philippe and Cahokia to accept American authority, securing the allegiance of over 300 people within 10 days. Turning his attention to Vincennes, Clark received an offer from Father Gibault to assist in the cause. Gibault's mission to Vincennes was a success, resulting in the town accepting American sovereignty and the raising of the American flag at Fort Sackville. Upon hearing the good news, Clark sent Captain Helm to command the Canadian militia at Vincennes, strengthening American control in the region. In the summer of 1778, in Detroit, Henry Hamilton got wind of Clark's successful takeover of the Illinois country by early August. Feeling the need to act fast, Hamilton pulled together a formidable force to reclaim Vincennes. This group included around 30 British soldiers, 145 militia members from Canada, and 60 Native American warriors led by the notable Ottawa leader Igushawa. They even had an advance group led by Captain Norman MacLeod from the Detroit Volunteer Militia. On October 7th, Hamilton and his main group kicked off their long trek to Vincennes, covering more than 300 miles. Along their journey, particularly when passing down the Wabash River, they made a stop at Ouiatenon. There, they managed to persuade Native Americans who had initially pledged loyalty to the Americans following Clark's roving through the Illinois country to join their cause. By the time Hamilton strolled into Vincennes on December 17th, his team had swollen to 500 men thanks to the increasing number of Native American recruits. However, upon nearing Fort Sackville, a twist happened. The Canadian militia, led by Captain Helm, decided to switch sides, essentially forcing the American command and a handful of soldiers to give up without a fight. The local residents quickly swapped back their loyalties to the British Crown, abandoning their previous American ties. Following the recapture of Vincennes, most of the Native Americans and members of the Detroit militia headed back to their homes, leaving Hamilton to hunker down at Fort Sackville with about 90 soldiers. Over the winter, he hatched plans to continue his campaign and take back the remaining towns along the Mississippi River come spring. On January 29, 1779, an Italian fur trader named Francis Vigo arrived in Kaskaskia to inform Clark about Hamilton retaking control of Vincennes. Clark realized that to prevent Hamilton from taking over the Illinois region in spring, he had to quickly plan a surprise attack on Vincennes in the winter. He expressed his thoughts in a letter to Governor Henry, saying, "I know the case is desperate, but sir, we must either quit the country or attack Mr. Hamilton. No time is to be lost. Who knows what fortune will do for us? Great things have been effected by a few men well conducted. Perhaps we may be fortunate. We have this consolation, that our cause is just, and that our country will be grateful and will not condemn our conduct in case we fall through. If we fail, the Illinois as well as Kentucky, I believe, is lost." By February 6, 1779, Clark was on his way to Vincennes with around 170 volunteers, including nearly half French militia from Kaskaskia, and Captain Bowman acting as his second in command. He described this mission as a forlorn hope. While he and his troops made their way by land, an armed row galley with 40 men was sent to block the British escape route by water along the Wabash River. Traveling approximately 180 miles across what is today, Illinois wasn't easy. Despite the winter not being harsh, frequent rains and flooded plains made the journey tough. The troops carried their supplies on pack horses and hunted wild game for food. After reaching the Little Wabash River on February 13th to find it extensively flooded, they constructed a large canoe to transport everything across. In the days following, they struggled with low supplies, and wading through water was a continuous challenge. By February 17th, despite being close to Fort Sackville, crossing the Embarrass River was impossible due to its high levels. They followed the river to meet the Wabash, where they started constructing boats to cross, battling low spirits and lack of food. On February 20th, they captured 5 hunters from Vincennes, who revealed Clark's army remained undetected and that Vincennes' residents were still supportive of the Americans. The following day, leaving their pack horses, they crossed the Wabash by canoe and trudged towards Vincennes, sometimes wading through deep water. The final stretch was the most challenging, crossing a flooded plain that required shuttling the exhausted men using canoes. Approaching Vincennes, they were assured of their secrecy by a friendly villager. Clark dispatched this villager with a message to the townspeople, warning of his imminent arrival and urging them to stay indoors if they did not wish to be counted as enemies. This message was publicly shared, and no one alerted Hamilton of Clark's forces closing in. On the evening of February 23rd, Clark and his forces arrived in Vincennes, splitting into 2 groups led by Clark himself and Bowman. They cleverly used the terrain to make it seem like they were a force of 1,000 men marching on the town. After local François Bousseron helped them dry their gunpowder, they started shooting at Fort Sackville, catching Hamilton, the fort's commander, off guard when a bullet wounded one of his soldiers. Throughout the night, Clark's men dug trenches near the fort and took shots at it from close range, while the British cannons could only destroy a couple of houses but failed to hit the attackers. Clark's troops even managed to silence the fort's cannons by shooting the gunners directly. The local villagers supported Clark by providing hidden gunpowder and ammunition. Additionally, a Piankashaw chief named Young Tobacco offered 100 warriors to help, but Clark declined to prevent any confusion in the darkness with other tribes. By the morning of February 24th, Clark didn't waste any time and demanded Hamilton's surrender. Hamilton tried to hold out, but after a few more hours of fighting, he looked to negotiate. Clark was adamant about an unconditional surrender or an immediate assault. Eventually, Hamilton proposed a truce, which Clark rejected, but he agreed to meet Hamilton to discuss terms. During the negotiation period, Clark made a controversial decision. He was informed about a British Allied group coming close to their camp and ordered their capture. This group, thinking they were being welcomed, were caught off guard, leading to a deadly skirmish where Clark's men captured and killed several of them. This act was intended to intimidate the British and create distrust among their allies. Finally, on February 25th, Hamilton surrendered, and his garrison was allowed to leave the fort, which was then claimed by the Americans and renamed Fort Patrick Henry. Following the surrender, Clark captured a British supply convoy and sent Hamilton and other key prisoners to Williamsburg, while Canadian allies of the British were released after pledging neutrality. Following his successful recapture of Vincennes, Clark was optimistic, remarking, "This strike will nearly put an end to the Indian War." Despite his high hopes, Clark's plans to lead an attack on Detroit were thwarted multiple times due to a lack of manpower and resources. In the meantime, the word of Clark's triumph spread, encouraging settlers to move into Kentucky. In 1979, recognizing the growing interest in the area, Virginia started a land office to manage Kentucky claims, leading to the founding of settlements like Louisville. When Virginia got wind of Clark's initial takeover of the Illinois country, they quickly claimed it, creating Illinois County, Virginia, in December 1778. By early 1781, Virginia decided to cede this region to the central government, which helped push forward the final approval of the Articles of Confederation and led to the creation of the Northwest Territory of the United States. Funding for the Illinois campaign came largely from locals and merchants in the area. Despite Clark submitting receipts to Virginia, many contributors, including notable figures like Father Gibault and François Ridé Bousseron, were not reimbursed, leading to financial hardship for some. On the brighter side, Clark and his soldiers received land near Louisville, known as Clark's Grant, in what is today Clarksville, Indiana, and neighboring areas. In 1789, at the urging of John Brown and other Congress members, Clark began documenting his Illinois campaign. This work, referred to as the Memoir, wasn't published in full until 1896, although it had influenced historians earlier. It later inspired novels and was commemorated by the naming of 4 U.S. Navy ships after the Battle of Vincennes. The discussion around whether George Rogers Clark truly conquered the Northwest Territory for the U.S. began shortly after the Revolutionary War. In July 1783, Governor Benjamin Harrison praised Clark for taking a vast territory from the British. Yet Clark modestly refrained from making such claims, particularly lamenting his failure to capture Detroit. Over time, Clark was often celebrated as the conqueror of the Northwest, but by the 20th century, this view was challenged. Some historians argued that Clark's withdrawal of troops from the Illinois country and the uninterrupted presence of most American Indians meant there was no actual conquest. Historian Randolph Downs in 1940 suggested that, instead of saying Clark conquered the area, it would be more fitting to say he helped the local French and Indian population shift away from the British's nominal control. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.